Hello, everybody. This is MERICS speaking. Welcome to our MERICS media briefing on Trump winning the White House, implications for US and European China policy. I am Claudia Wessling, Director of Communications and Publications here at MERICS. I will guide you through this very brief 30-minute sessions for which we have gathered two of our best experts here in the house. Mikko Huotari is with us, Executive Director of MERICS, and we have Abigaël Vasselier joining us today. She's the Director of Policy and European Affairs at our institute. Briefly on the proceedings, Mikko and Abigaël will kick us off with short inputs and first takes of what they think the election result in the US will mean for transatlantic China policy going forward and also for EU-European countries' relations for China. And afterwards, it will be time for you to ask questions. And let me once again remind you, please switch off your microphones. Thank you. And that said, I would hand it over to Mikko Huotari for his first input. And he will focus on US-China relations as we move forward.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Claudia. Warm welcome also from my side. I want to make three quick points on my expectations for US-China policy under a Trump 2.0 presidency. First, the core of US-China policy will shift. It will shift towards more hardening and more hawkishness. Second, the essence of Trump's foreign policy approach, transactionalism, remains unchanged, so we need to be prepared for some surprises. And third, China is both more vulnerable but also more prepared today, quite principled and hardened internally, and will engage, as many other countries across the world, in transactionalism and seeking opportunities, both globally but also in relations to the US. So first, the shifting core of US-China policy. We have a pretty wide spectrum of isolationists, restrainers, primacists in the ecosystem of Trump advisors. What is clear, I think, is that the central locus of China policy will shift with Trump presidency, Republican control of Senate and House towards a more hardened core. Why? Because leading Republican policymakers see China as a threat to American security and prosperity, ranging from Lighthizer to Mike Gallagher in the House Select Committee to Matt Pottinger and others. So the direction seems pretty clear as a structural trend towards full spectrum economic and strategic confrontation with China. So aiming to limit dependencies, assert US military presence in the region, and also promote on more tactical decoupling technological scenarios moving forward. So how can we understand what is on the menu of China policy options? I would look at what the House of Representatives has put out in terms of legislation already in this summer in the China Week, as they've called it. It's not enacted fully, so this is probably coming more to the forefront now with Republicans more in charge. There's these 150 policy recommendations of the House Select Committee, and this most likely will play a bigger role now moving forward. There's the Heritage Project 2025, reducing dependency, reducing China's influence, reducing engagement with China. All of that will define the spectrum of possible policy options. And the principles that emerge from that are quite clear. The US will other China even more, normalize China being depicted as a threat. They will focus on winning strategic competition, not just managing it. They will focus on weakening China, not just slowing it down. And they will focus on containment and not just constraining China. So in concrete policy terms, what does that mean? I think we are all expecting some kind of intensified tariff action. The degree of that, I think, is still unclear. 60% are in the room. That seems more of a negotiation stance than an actual policy line. We expect more technology controls, maybe also more financial decoupling. We look at harder deterrence, so increased military posture in the region. We will probably see more data disentanglement, anything related to the cloud, AI, crypto will be US first, absolutely without China content in it. And there will be a lot of stress on the people-to-people ties in academia, but also moving forward. The second point, despite this shift in the structural core of China policy in the US towards a more hardening, the essence of Trump's approach, naked transactionalism, deal-oriented nationalism, remains unchanged. So we will see more tariffs and other forms of economic leverage, not just to exploit and deepen China's vulnerabilities and weaken it, but also to extract concessions. Now, it's a bit less clear what the US under Trump would actually want from China, but it's probably related to trade imbalances, energy trade, restriction China's negative influence. But it's also possible, although I consider it rather unlikely at this point, that there will be some kind of bigger deal related to investment in the US economy instead of Chinese exports. And Elon Musk and maybe also Trump would be certainly open to the idea of $1 billion investments in new plans, job creation, tax revenues, supporting US-China supply chain development. That's a possibility. So we need to also be prepared for Trump as a disruptor, but this time as a deviation from the structural core of more hawkish China policies, also under the influence of people such as Elon Musk. What is clear is that the context in which this deal making takes place is different, and that's clearly also the case for China. So how is China prepared and responding? It's more vulnerable today. US policies will hit its export and high-tech driven growth strategy. It will, on the other hand, be more convenient also for Xi to justify his continued course internally and to focus on external threats, the need to unite on its own priorities. Overall perceptions on the Chinese side will be more entrenched. So US be seen as containing and hardening competition, and the Chinese side clearly sees it in the same way. But they will also be quite capable of doing transactional policy and will seek to exploit any opportunities on the global scale that might emerge from that. So what specifically is in the realm of the possible? They will seek influence via corporate networks, specifically Elon Musk. They will probably propose some kind of greenfield investment expansion in the US. Could be around the automotive supply chain or cheap solar green tech. They will try to make Trump great again as a peace president. So obviously we are quite concerned about the possibilities around Russia-Ukraine relations and whatever China's role might be in that. And they will exploit new opportunities, massaging Trump around the issue of Taiwan and seeking. And I think that's quite important to advance its strategic space globally in the international front, maybe being a bit more softer on regional relations in Asia, continue to project stability where the US seemingly offers chaos and uncertainty. Overall, that's my last point, China is better prepared. They have a hardened internal system in general. They have worked on countermeasures such as controls over technology and critical raw materials, their own listing of commercial entities, and they're probably also more willing and less constrained to hit back at specific companies if that's required. So on the economic front, specific measures such as a devaluation is probably in the realm of the possible. Maybe the stimulus package will be redrafted, but that's a question for tomorrow when the Chinese National People's Congress will meet. It's difficult to imagine that the tissue of bilateral relations, including on climate, on arms control, the boundaries, the guardrails that the Biden administration has established will just continue as they were in place over the past 12 months. Thank you. And with that, I would hand over to Abi to touch on European relations.
Thanks, Mikko. On my side, and I'll focus on what it means for Europe and what it means for the transatlantic relationship. My first point is that compared to 2016, Europe is better prepared for a Trump II administration with big question marks and uncertainties. So there has been some Trump-proofing exercises and some preparedness efforts done across capitals and in Brussels. We are going to have a decisive European Council today and tomorrow. But there are big questions. The first one is, will this be enough? And how much China can play into possible breaches of unity when it comes to Europe. Two parameters would be essential. because this transatlantic discussion on China does not happen in a void. And the two questions that we will have to answer is whether the US is going to continue giving security guarantees to Europe and the support to Ukraine. And the second point is whether we are going to see 10 to 20% tariffs on Europe. And clearly, if one of these two components falls short, so Europe is going to have difficulties because it will lack political capital and economic resources to actually have and take a tougher approach on China. The political forces across Europe have changed, and this is something to take into account when we look at what's the state of play in Europe in dealing with Trump 2 administration. And we have a conservative and populist bloc composed of Italy, of basically Meloni, Fico, and Orban that could play both in terms of putting their transactional capacity in the hands of a European approach to the US, but could also be the Trojan horses of China. So overall, there is this sense that we are coming at a tipping point where we need a new transatlantic deal on China, and Europe needs to basically work on the offer that it would give to the Trump administration. So we need to move away as fast as possible from the panic mode in which we are to start working on developing a European offer to the Trump administration, on which we are clear China is going to play a key role. My second point is related to the fact that we need to acknowledge that before this Trump 2 administration, China has become a dividing factor in the transatlantic relationship. So this is why the parameters for a new transatlantic deal on China is not the same than it was during the two previous administrations. First, we have reached trust deficit that is partially related to China, with a sense in Europe that US foreign policy prioritized China over Russia, with a sense that with the Inflation Reduction Act and continuing tariff with a Trump style, there have been from the Biden administration a lack of consideration for the alliance. China has turned into a domestic question on both sides of the Atlantic, and this completely changes the debate and the political capital that can be put on the China question. And when you have to navigate national security and economic self-sufficiency, of course, the consideration of your allies and partner comes second. And finally, we have been divided on what is the end game vis-à-vis China for a long time with the US, and this basically makes transatlantic convergence extremely difficult. Despite that, we need to acknowledge that the Trump presidency is going to be a very different conversation when it comes to China and when it comes to building a transatlantic agenda on China. What will matter and what should we watch in the coming months? First, there is this question of interests, and Trump has been clear that he will define a China policy that is following its US national interests, and the Republicans that we have heard over the past weeks have been clear Europe needs to follow its own interests, and either our interests converge and we can work together or not. The question is then, what are European interests? Is managing coexistence with China enough in terms of European objective vis-à-vis China? Do we still have expectation vis-à-vis China that are at play? So first, identifying what we want for ourselves is going to be essential. Second, there is a question of timing. And here, when we look at the trade, the technology, the security conversations that we are going to have with the US, Trump decisions are going to come extremely fast when the European response is going to come slower. just because we have 27 national interests to basically reconcile. And on top of that, we are coming probably at a point where unity is going to be problematic. On the security side, I think the priority for Europe will be to understand the burden sharing debate and get it right. And the US foreign policy adjustment is something that has been in the making already under the Biden administration. So we shouldn't be surprised, but we are lacking a good and solid ground to have this conversation on burden sharing here in Europe. On trade, we are clear that the first thing to watch out is whether we will have the capacity to have a trade deal with the US, whether we can come up with sectoral agreements, whether we can solve part of some, at least, of our fundamental divergences, then to be able to move away to looking at cooperation on procurement, on resilient supply chains, with instruments that are very different, that will be used in a very different way. But where we are in Europe at the moment of integrating the level playing field question and the national security question through and looking at this question through the same lens as the US. The WTO will remain a big question, and how are we going to address the trade deficit question that will be the priority of Trump will also be the big question. So can the European offer include some elements that have to do with addressing trade deficit will be essential. On the technology side, the main point where the US is going to look at Europe is our capacity to restrict tech flows to China, and whether we are going to do it because we're forced to do it, or because we have come to the conclusion that we need to do it. This will be a key question. We will have the capacity to find convergence when it comes to border control tools or money flows on the technology aspects, but yet this big question on technology flows to China will remain. And my last point is going to be about this question of what will happen when China adjusts its policy vis-à-vis Europe. And here we need to be clear. China is going to adjust. China is going to come to Europe with an offer, and we are going to see some positive signals from the Europeans as well. There will probably be a flurry of visits to China in the coming month, and we have already the Italian president going to China this week, and there will be probably a Chinese offer, be it at the multilateral level, for instance, on the reform of the WTO, or at the bilateral level with investment coming. And is the new US administration going to make the Europeans hedge? This is a big question, and this is something the US, our US partner, is going to be looking at. So basically, in short, we should expect that European unity is going to be tested. We should expect that, despite the level of preparedness that I think we reached, there are likely to be some divisions over where we land vis-à-vis China at the European level. I will leave it at that and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Abigaël and Mikko, for your inputs. So Europe is getting under pressure basically from both sides. We have an America that is taking a very much more hawkish stance towards China and might have expectations towards Europeans that Europeans cannot fulfill. The question stands in the room whether the US would be interested in getting to a new transatlantic deal on China to begin with. And then we also have a China that will try to make the best of the changed political situation and make offers to both the US and Europe. And we will need to ask ourselves, where will we end in this negotiation plan?